The following production is presented by League InfoSite and the Credit Union Broadcast Experience, QTV.
Hello, I'm Sean Wolbert.
And I'm Gloria Ledoux, bringing you the quarterly compliance update at the CU Compliance Connection by InfoSite, only on QTV. This presentation will provide information on the compliance issues your credit union has worked on in the second quarter of 2013 and the issues it will face in the third quarter.
In the second quarter of 2013, we've seen a lot of change. There have been changes with the BSA forms and e-filing requirements. The CFPB, as always, has been very busy, giving us escrow requirements, mandatory arbitration agreements, and the requirement for credit insurance rules. The NCUA has given us investment evaluations, and the joint agencies together have published new rules for the garnishment of federal benefit payments. So it's been a busy second quarter.
We will also go over compliance topics that you may need to implement in the third quarter of this year. Those topics include FTC revisions to the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, or COPPA, NCUA's new rule regarding loan participations, and some 2014 actions by the CFPB. In fact, most of the regulatory action that we have seen recently comes from the CFPB amending and reissuing final mortgage rules.
And it has been a busy time with them and their publications.
Yes, it has.
By April 1st, credit unions had to adopt BSA e-filing. Now this is extremely important because I know that some smaller credit unions have struggled with this requirement. The e-filing is required no matter what at this point. There was a period of time when you had the option and you could actually get FinCEN to provide you with additional time to meet those requirements, but that time has passed.
Yes.
And as of April, you had to file everything electronically. In addition to the electronic filing requirements, there are no CTR and SAR formats with additionally required information that you're gathering from your members. So it's important that you realize and understand those requirements. It's also important to understand, as stated in FinCEN's training, that credit unions may report suspicious transactions that they believe are relevant to a violation of law or regulation, but whose reporting is not required by 31 CFR Part 103.18. And the importance of that is when you file your SAR, you get safe harbor.
Right.
They're not going to prosecute you if you have done what you need to do to file that information. It's in not filing that you really create a liability for your credit union. So be safe. Go ahead and file even if you don't think it's required based on the SAR rules. If you think something's suspicious, file a suspicious activity report.
Even if it's under the 5,000 limit.
Even if it's under the 5,000 limit.
Since 2010, credit unions have been required to escrow for higher price mortgage loans secured by first lien on a principal dwelling for 1 year. As of June 1st, that requirement has increased to 5 years. However, the CFPB has provided for an exemption for small creditors if the following conditions are met. More than half of your first lien covered transactions made to rural or underserved counties, if you have assets less than $2 billion, and if you originate with your affiliates less than 500 first lien mortgages. And also, you and your affiliates cannot maintain escrow accounts. There were exceptions for escrows maintained under the previous HOEPA rules. However, to qualify for the exemption, you are required to stop escrowing altogether after June 1st, 2013. However, just to keep us on our toes, on July 2nd, the CFPB published proposed revisions to the escrows rule. Because they made changes to the definition of rural, the proposed rules allow you to qualify for the small creditor exemption if more than half your loans were made to rural or underserved counties, and you would have had qualified in the past 3 calendar years for the small creditor exemption. And that's assuming all the other criteria were met. They're also proposing an effective date of January 1st, 2014. So if you think that you can qualify for the small servicer exemption now, but you were previously escrowing after June 1st, you would still qualify if you would, based on the 3-year rule change for the amendment. And that will begin on January 1st.
I think part of this too is that this is the beginning of us seeing over and over again the CFPB giving us the final rules, telling us it's the final rules, and then amending what we're trying to implement, and then amending that again.
And for this particular rule, it's beneficial, which is good. I'm glad they're doing it because now they're looking back on 3 years worth of data and will qualify you for that exemption based on the past 3 years. So they are making some improvements and granting more exemptions, opening that up to more people that would qualify.
For binding arbitration agreements, in April, the CFPB actually proposed the rule and finalized it that you could not have mandatory arbitration agreements in mortgage lending documents. This has been a change because most credit unions did have the requirement for mandatory arbitration because it made it better for the credit union and often for the member if you went to arbitration rather than taking it to court in a lawsuit against the credit union. But the CFPB has stated that they don't feel that that's beneficial to consumers overall and have made that against the rules. Now, this did close on June 23rd. However, the CFPB has put out a request for more information on arbitration agreements. So don't be surprised if we see an amendment to this rule in the near future.
Right, and this was specifically for credit cards as well. So, as Sean said, be prepared. We may have to be changing our credit card agreements soon as well. Because of confusion related to the prohibition on the financing of premiums or fees for credit insurance, such as credit life insurance, or as the CFP indicated, while we address some interpretive issues that have arisen, the CFPB delayed the effective date, which was June 1st. On July 2nd, in the same proposed amendments as the escrow rules, the CFPB proposed clarifications regarding the prohibition on financing. First, the CFPB clarified that they believe a creditor finances credit insurance premiums when a member is provided the right to defer payment of premiums or fees. They requested comment on this proposal, along with a few other proposed revisions. So more to come on this when the rule is finalized. Regarding the NCUA investment evaluation, as of June 11, 2013, credit ratings were no longer permitted to be used as a standard for creditworthiness. This requirement was a part of Dodd-Frank and also applied to regulatory agencies using credit rating references in their regulations. So instead of your typical AA or AAA rating, the NCUA has made revisions to their regulations to use two standards: investment grade and minimal amount of credit risk. So in evaluating the creditworthiness of a security, a credit union now has to consider additional factors which are outlined in the new regulation.
In regards to the garnishment of federal benefit payments, the definition of a benefit payment has been revised to mean a direct deposit payment that includes not only an XX in positions 54 and 55 of the company entry description field for the ACH transaction, but also the number 2 encoded in the originator status code field of the batch header record of the direct deposit entry.
That was a mouthful, Sean.
That is the actual definition in terms that they're using so that you understand where to find this information.
Okay.
The definition of a garnishment order and order are revised to include a levy and also orders issued by states and municipalities as well as orders to freeze assets. In the past, federal benefit payments have not been protected from these orders. But going forward, credit unions will need to follow the garnishment of federal benefit payment rules when they receive these orders. The final definition modification for the protected amount now refers to the balance in the account when the account review is performed. This change means that the balance will include intraday items such as ATMs or cash withdrawals. It's important to note that credit unions should not use the Reg CC available funds balance when determining garnishment amounts, but should be aware that the requirement to provide access to the protected amount is subject to the usual restrictions on funds availability under Reg CC. In addition, the agencies do not intend that any line of credit associated with the account be considered a part of the account balance.
Now that we have covered the compliance issues that credit unions have worked to implement over the second quarter of the year, we need to address upcoming compliance challenges credit unions will have to manage in the third quarter.
The first of these challenges is new requirements that the FTC has proposed and brought about through the COPA rule, or the Child Online Privacy Protection Act. The primary goal of COPA has been to give parents control over what information is collected online from their young children. And both of us are parents. We understand the importance of this and how important it is to protect children while they're online. There's so much risk there.
That's very true.
The rule was designed to protect children under the age of 13 while addressing the dynamic nature of the internet. It's important for me to point out that the rule governs the online collection of personal information from children by a credit union, even if the children volunteer the information or are not required by the credit union to input the information to participate on the credit union's website or service. The rule also covers credit unions that allow children to publicly post personal information. The Federal Trade Commission also made it clear in the amended rule that the passive tracking of children's personal information through a persistent identifier and not just active collection is also covered by the COPA rule. And Gloria, I really think this is one of those areas that is a real risk for credit unions, because often they don't even realize that they're collecting this information in behind the scenes through their IT department,
Right.
and it's just a part of providing the service to their members,
Right.
and they don't realize that they're collecting the data that they shouldn't
And
be collecting
storing
on
it.
children and
Right.
storing that data. You're right. The rule requires an online privacy policy, notice to parents, parental consent to information collection and use, parental access to their children's personal information, and parents should be able to prevent further use or collection of that information, and maintaining the confidentiality, security, and integrity of the information. And I think as an industry, we do that very well.
Right.
And the final thing is retaining that personal information collected online from a child for only as long as it's needed for the purpose that it was originally collected.
The NCUA published their final rule on loan participations, which applies to both federal credit unions and federally insured credit unions. The final rule requires credit unions to adopt a written loan participation policy with certain provisions, including concentration limits, including the maximum limit a credit union intends to place on its outstanding participations, and parameters for review, including a periodic review for adherence to those parameters. Also included must be underwriting standards. The final rule also includes a concentration limit on the aggregate amount of loan participations that may be purchased from any one originating lender, not to exceed the greater of $5 million or 100% of net worth. Another limit on the aggregate amount of loan participations purchased with respect to a single borrower or group of associated borrowers, which is not to exceed 15% of the credit union's net worth. Both of these limits can actually be waived by the NCUA with proper approval. There are also requirements for the loan participation agreement, including a provision requiring the originating lender retain 5% of the outstanding balance through the life of the loan. Federal credit unions under the Federal Credit Union Act must require the originating lender to retain at least 10% of the loan, and that's in the industry what we call having skin in the game. Other requirements for the agreement include identifying each participated loan, detail servicing responsibilities for the loan, and include disclosure requirements regarding the ongoing financial condition of the loan, the borrower, and the servicer. Thankfully, on July 3rd, the NCUA changed the effective date of this regulation to September 23rd, as opposed to the original date of July 25th, which really wouldn't leave enough time for credit unions to update their processes and their policies. So credit unions that currently have loan participations that exceed these limits will be grandfathered until the excess has been paid off or sold in the normal course of business.
That's good.
Yeah. All right, on to the CFPB. So we had a couple things come out of the CFPB: the mortgage rule implementation page, the small entity guides, and the readiness guide checklist. So since the beginning of April, the CFPB has requested your comments based on information requests and proposed amendments on 16 occasions.
And that 16 occasions is just through the second quarter.
Oh,
and
yeah.
They are on a roll.
They really are.
This has not ended. They continue to push things out to our industry asking for information, and we know what that leads to.
Right.
When they ask for information, they're in their minds already planning amendments to the rules. So we are far from having final rules on most of the final mortgage rules.
Right, but we encourage credit unions to comment because we have noticed that the CFPB is listening to what we have to say. So as an industry, we need to make sure we're speaking up and telling them how these rules are affecting us. But the CFPB has addressed issues from multiple amendments to the final rules, which we have briefly touched on in this video. But additional proposed amendments include a revised definition of mortgage loan originators and how that applies to tellers or administrative staff. So we had a lot of concerns there from some of our credit unions, so this will be important when they clarify this. Yeah. An exception to the prohibition on balloon features for high-cost mortgages for small creditors, regardless of whether they operate in rural or underserved areas. So this is another good benefit that the CFPB is making. And the comment period for these proposed revisions, it closed on July 22nd. So we can expect to see some final rules addressing these amendments within the next couple of months.
The other thing I want to say about the amendments, a lot of the things that I've been seeing in the industry is because there have been so many changes, people are really pushing back and saying, I'm not going to read this. I'm not even going to pay attention to this until the final rules come out. And I want to caution you, don't do that.
Right.
You need to understand these revisions as they go through, because just because they're proposing amendments to other things, it doesn't mean that the rules won't go into effect and they won't amend them at some time in the future.
That's right.
So it really is important that you pay attention to what the CFPB is doing and really research what those finalized rules are so that you understand them and begin to implement them, because we may also have a very short implementation period.
That's right.
Because they've already given us time to begin that process.
That's right. That's right. Speaking of finalized final rules, it's just like an oxymoron or something like that. The CFPB has finalized some amendments which include further clarification on the timing of ARM notice requirements, further clarification on determining the small servicer exemption for the final mortgage servicing rules, and timing requirements if the 5,000 threshold is exceeded. They've also given some guidance on qualified mortgages, such as a creditor is not required to sell a loan to a GSE for the loan to be a QM, rather just be eligible to be purchased. The ability to repay revisions and debt-to-income calculations. So again, the mortgage rule implementation page on the CFPB website is going to be very useful in centralizing all of these changes into one location. And we really hope that the CFPB is actively revising their resources, such as the small entity guides, as they finalize these revisions to the rules. Because they have them all in one spot for us to utilize, but it's not going to be as helpful if they don't keep making the revisions as they make changes to the final rule. So I really hope that they stay on top of that. Otherwise, the mortgage implementation page is really a good resource for credit unions to use.
It is, and those small entity guides are a great resource. There are some stuff that the CFPB puts out that really doesn't provide enough information, but those small entity guides,
They're helpful.
they're very helpful.
And the readiness checklist that came out, there are some good things about the readiness checklist, so we encourage credit unions to take a look at that as well. This concludes our overview of compliance issues your credit union has recently faced and is facing in the third quarter. Thank you for joining Sean and I at the CU Compliance Connection, and stay tuned for future broadcasts on issues that affect your credit union.
We're here to help you at the CU Compliance Connection by InfoSight, only on Cube TV.
Thanks for watching the #1 compliance program for the credit union community. Stay tuned.